old Asian countries.
English because he's from Foundation. I'm from Moscow University. It's quite interesting.
Is to maintain and
В русской культуре есть
You know, there are two images of Eastern Russia and Siberia in Russian culture. These are contradictory positives. One image is very positive. This is Sonia Pugacheva, 20 years old. She's a member of a traditional old believers family in Siberia. So this is a positive image of Siberia as a huge area, very rich in natural resources, some special kind of ethnic population. The American geographer Smith was saying about its hard land for hard people. So this is some conception of Siberia, of a country packed with wealth, but difficult to live in, and it's only very strong and healthy people who can live there. But alternatively, there's a very negative image, and this is illustrated by this picture. You know, in Russia, there is an image of a bag without a handle, because it's difficult to carry it on, because it doesn't have a handle, but it's too valuable to drop it. So this metaphor is about this big country which forced Russia to develop extensively rather than intensively. Andrei Trevich, modern geographer, says that if we had the Pacific Ocean just beyond the Urals, we would be one of the wealthiest countries of the world. And this idea was reiterated by many philosophers and historians. But in the Russian culture, there is a strong concept that Russia proper ends with the Urals. And the Siberian residents think the same about the rest of Russia. We had surveys, we launched surveys in the Far East, and we cunningly asked Krasnoyarsk residents the question, a smart question, when was the last time you were in Russia? Only 60% were surprised and answered, well, we are Russia, and the other 40% took it for granted that the place they live is not Russia. This is actually a very strong feeling in the culture of Eastern and Western Russian regions. Think what Siberians think about the rest of Russia. If you talk to them, if you are from Moscow, European part, they have a very strong feeling. They seem to be offended and unhappy that the federal center is sucking out all the resources from Siberia and gives nothing in exchange. Eastern studies. No, I was reading the websites and the forums after Medvedev visited to Siberia and Far East, and people were so aggressive, so critical in depth. But this is strange because he really brought some good things to. I know we have lots of gifts. Very little time has passed since we have made the study, but I know you are monitoring the situation. After the protests in the Far East, how is the situation developing now, and what are your forecasts? Are there any signs that the center is eager to make adjustment to its policy, and how is the local situation developing? In fact, it's been several months since I was in the Far East last time, but I have people who are collecting information for me there. Initially, in the immediate aftermath, Mr. Darkin made strange moves. He was very effective. He met with the activists, the leaders of the protests, and tried to involve them in developing crisis response policies. But then the wave of protests became stronger than his influence, and the process became uncontrollable. Manufacturing enterprises, export-producing enterprises came to a standstill, and Darkin only was just promised that these enterprises will be nationalized. It was a stupid move. He disoriented the local residents, and because it was not clear who will buy the products of the enterprise and who will pay the wages to the workers. So in fact, the administration made initially very good steps to balance, to counter the protests, to cushion the protests, but then they lost control. There is very little hope that the central government will make some moves, some effective moves. I was surprised, I was shocked that some very promising measures that President Medvedev put forward to bring the Far East closer to the center geographically, such as provide subsidies for railway tickets. This was not, the population was not impressed at all for some reason. Another interesting thing happened. Premier Putin announced that imported cars will be subject to high import duties. This was a protectionist measure for Russian auto manufacturers. Well, it would seem that people in Tolyatti would thank him, but in fact on the 1st of March the results of elections were very bad for the United Russia, worst in the history of elections. So Russian auto manufacturers did not appreciate the gift which Putin made them. Even less than people in the Far East appreciated his move. The crisis that we're facing will affect dozens of thousands of people in the Far East. You know, I was marveling at the drivers who were bringing used cars from Europe to Russia, people who were trading in cars and buying and selling them. All these people automatically lose their occupation, lose their jobs. And also, local people are very unhappy about what Moscow does. Academician Minaker was writing in his academic paper that some decisions made by the STEM Duma are the results of very aggressive lobbying from retailers and other large corporations. For example, there were many policies trying to restrict shuttle trading, cross-border trading between Russia and China, just because large retailers were facing competition from them. So the allowed weight of luggage that is set for such small-scale traders has been reduced, and this is a heavy blow for small business, actually. And this, of course, is seen as Moscow attempts to suffocate the region, to put a pressure on the region. So I'm really not very optimistic about the prospects of Far East development.
Question to Dr. Kobayashi. Does your institute fulfill any studies in estimating on demand function for gas, coal, or electricity? Because it's necessary to understand the possibilities of export from Russia, for example, for gas and coal. If yes, where is possible to find them?
Thank you for your question. Unfortunately, I can't get you a precise answer. But if you look at the future near-term natural gas demand in Japan, it will be badly damaged by the financial crisis, and indeed, Japanese energy buyers struggle to divert their long-term contract LNG to other locations. But in the mid to long term, we are now discussing about the midterm GHG reduction target. And the answer to the final decision has not been made, so I cannot say anything precisely. But such midterm GHG reduction target will affect the mid to long-term Japanese energy demand structure. I'm sorry.
I mean empirical calculations by using econometric instruments.
Yes. I don't have a specific number now.
Maybe somebody in Japan do it?
Отлично, спасибо.
Спасибо большое, спасибо участникам.
Thank you very much. Let's thank the panelists, and now we are changing the settings a little bit to move into the next session.
Okay, we're ready for our closing session. We have two excellent speakers who are going to give us a broad overview presentation. Our first closing keynote is Dr. Lilia Shetsova. She is a professor and senior associate at the Carnegie Moscow Center. She co-chairs the Russian Politics and Political Institutions Project at the Carnegie Moscow Center. Before joining Carnegie Moscow Center, she was deputy director of the Moscow Institute of International Economic and Political Studies at the Russian Academy of Sciences.
If you are a journalist, you could be happy with these wonderfully sounding programs, but they have very little value. When I say that the center, the federal center, cannot understand what is happening beyond Urals, is that Siberia and anything east of the Urals is viewed as something homogeneous. But in fact, this territory must be split at least into 7 parts, and each of them should require a very special approach in terms of development strategy. Number 1 is southern Siberia, Altai, Novosibirsk, Kemerovo. This is a very favorable area in terms of climate and natural conditions. These cities are located close to each other. Another region, number 2, is southwestern Siberia, Tyumen, Omsk and Kurgan, which is very close and very much associated with the Urals and the rest of Europe. This is civilized Siberia and well-population. Number 3 is Tyumen regions, which depends very much on oil. Number 4 is Siberia in the Yenisei River basin. We spent 2 years doing research along the Yenisei River all the way to Mongolia. So this is a very contradictory situation there. The Baikal region is the most sad situation there. Irkutsk, Buryat and Chita is the most isolated or locked area. Number 6 would be northeast, has the most difficult climatic conditions. For some reason, its geographical parameters are also applied to the rest of Siberia, which is not true. And finally, the Far East, which is not homogeneous as such, but people tend to identify the so-called islands, including Sakhalin and Kamchatsky Peninsula. And of course, the southern part of Far East is very favorable. I would like to conclude by saying a few words about the Far East, and in this way I will illustrate the diversity of Siberia. When we asked people how long, when was the last time you were in Russia, so we in Irkutsk we received 60% of answers like we are in Russia already. But in the Far East there are more people who feel they are in Russia, just maybe because they are living close to very different cultures like China, Japan and Korea, and they feel their special Russian identity. And they don't want to be called the Far East by claiming that far is a very subjective concept, and being east is also very questionable because we are part of Russia, etc. So from this point of view, we expect no separatism on their part, unless it is a joke. On the other hand, according to academician Menaker, there has been a major shift in the region towards external economic relations rather than relations with the rest of Russia. In the Soviet times, despite the proximity with China and Japan, only 6% of export of products were exported in the Far East. Still, 3/4 of Far East production is domestically consumed. It is quite a large territory, and it does not only rely on exports. About one-fifth of the products was exported to other regions of the Soviet Union. In 1996, this was reduced to 7%, and in 2006, only 3% goes to the rest of Russia. But this also takes into account smuggling processes. Some people might know that Japanese data on fish imports from Russia are 4 times as high as Russian data about exports of fish to Japan. So these calculations show that the Far East is a very vibrant region, even compared to Siberia. People are very much self-sufficient and independent. They pay little attention to what government does. People are very adaptable. It's a typical frontier region. Law and order is a problem, but at least it is a living region compared to eastern Siberia. Of course, in this recent crisis, a heavy blow for the Far East was 92% increase in import duty for used cars. And we read in the papers that hundreds of vessels are stuck in the seaport of Vladivostok, that shipments reduced by 52%, almost, and the export of round logs almost stopped. So, you know, the central government made just 2 or 3 steps and hit the economy of the Far East very heavily, in addition to the crisis itself. I remember that back in 1993 there were plans to outlaw right-hand drive cars, And we succeeded in countering this measure. Because in fact this move was lobbied by companies which imported used cars from Europe. And we succeeded in explaining to President Yeltsin that if this measure is implemented, the Far East will not vote for Yeltsin. So, you know, this time the government decided to go against the Far East. And I believe this reflects substantial weaknesses in economy management in Russia. You probably know that shortly after this duty was introduced, there were many protests in the Far East, and the movement Tigr was set up. They're all very leftist. They protest under red banners, and the strength of these protests cannot be compared to what was happening in the European Russia just a year ago. And this resulted in a very rapid maturing of political mentality, or political conscience of residents. So, what are the weaknesses of the policy? It was immediately obvious that the decision to abolish the system of governor's election was wrong. When governors were elected, people could at least protest, address their protests to the governor. But now they go immediately to Moscow or against Moscow. The second result is that any kind of protest now is immediately monopolized by leftist forces. In the Far East, in fact, there are very few people who are actually communists, but just because the Communist Party remains the only organized political opposition, they managed to capture these movements. So it's a very contradictory situation. On the one hand, the government seems to be caring about the Far East. On the other hand, we see that the government is doing something which is very detrimental to what is happening in the eastern parts of Russia. And this is another proof of the fact that the government still does not subject its own decisions to regional scrutiny, not trying to imagine how this will affect the future of individual regions.
Today, as a commentator of this session, I'd like to make a short comment about the energy resource development in Russia's east. First of all, I'd like to explain a little bit about the energy demand situations in Asia. As in other energy markets, the situation in Asia is significantly changed in the fourth quarter last year due to the financial crisis. Both Japanese and Korean oil demand decreased last year, but if you look at the rate of decrease in the fourth quarter, they are significantly larger than the annual figures. If you look at the Chinese oil demand, it increased last year, but if you look at the fourth quarter, it remains flat. And if you look at the demand in December, it decreased by more than 6%. Natural gas demand was healthier compared to the oil market. but the fourth quarter demand in Japan and Korea decreased. Although I could not get the number of fourth quarter natural gas demand in China, I'm sure its growth rate is much lower than the annual figure, 14%, because of the demand shrink in the industrial sector. In China, government economic rescue package will surely raise, to some extent, energy demand in the country, but its effect is still unknown. So the impact of financial crisis in Asian energy demand is evident. So if we think about short-term energy market outlook, its energy demand growth in Asia will be moderate. But if we think about from a mid to long-term perspective, its energy demand, we think, will surely grow in Asia. This is because the current slowdown of energy demand growth in Asia is because of the slowdown of economic activities, not by efficiency of energy usage. So once the economic activity becomes back to the growing trend, Asia's energy demand will surely back to the upward trend also. And modernization process in Asian countries still at the early stage compared to the advanced economies. So this will also raise the oil demand in these countries. And improving income per capita in Asia will also raise the energy demand in these countries. So we think energy demand in Asia from mid to long term will surely grow. So Asia still has great expectations in energy supply, energy development in Russia's east. In order to fill in the gap between energy demand and supply in the future, appropriate investment in a timely manner is necessary. In this aspect, incoming commencement of energy supply from Sakhalin Island is a great achievement for Asian countries because it gave another sources of the gas supply with great resource potential and different geographical locations from traditional supply sources. Now I'd like to mention that Russia will find more needs in developing energy resources in Russia's east. It's been Moscow's long-term objective to develop eastern region because of the decreasing population and low income level compared to the central regions. And these days, financial crisis impacted the region, and social frustration is growing in the region, as seen in the demonstration in Vladivostok recently. So the need for economic development in this region remains the same. In addition to these traditional reasons, as repeatedly pointed out in previous presentations today, Russia will find more uncertainties in European market for its gas export. This is firstly because demand disruption by financial crisis in the short term, but in the mid to long term, Europeans' effort to adopt more renewable energies in the energy mix will affect the oil and gas demand in Europe, and also the experience of supply disruption in January this year encouraged some European countries to divert natural gas supply sources or to import LNG. So my point here is because the uncertainties in European market is growing, the relative importance of Asian market is increasing, and Russia will find more incentives to to develop energy resources in Russia's east. In pursuing such energy resource development, Asian countries are of course willing to participate in such energy resource development. But in pursuing such development, more coordination is required, in my understanding. Here I'd like to emphasize that energy resources in Russia is very important, but it is important for all Asian countries. So it should be developed in a way that will benefit all Asian countries. The most important thing in developing energy resources in Russia's east is to maintain or improve the stability of market. If the competition among investors become more excessive or more exclusive, that will create political rivalries among investors and also lead to instability of market. So coordination among investors is very important, and the utilization of market mechanism are key issues in my understanding. In pursuing such coordination, multilateral approach will be an effective one, because this will avoid excessive competition among investors and also facilitate investors to share risk and burdens. In this framework, in this approach, government has to be involved, because energy resource development in Russia's east is high risk by nature, both from geological and political aspect. And this kind of multilateral approach or multilateral framework will lower the hurdles for private players to participate or invest in energy resource development in Russia's east. So multilateral approach will be more favorable ones, in my understanding. These are points of my comments, main points, conclusions. First, Asia's energy demand has been largely affected by the financial crisis. But if you look at the long-term figure, its demand will surely grow. And Asia has strong expectations in the energy supply from Russia's east. So it should be developed in a timely manner. And Russia will find more needs, more incentives in developing energy resources Russia's east from internal and external reasons. And finally, to maximize the benefit of energy development.
Leadership. Just remember, I want you to remind you at least twice or 3 times, both then President Putin and then President Medvedev and Prime Minister Vladimir Putin several times were discussing the issue of Russia's failure to diversify its economy and the consequences that are the results of their failure to diversify Russian economy. So, in fact, what we have all evidence of the existence in Russia.
My name is Vorontsov. I'm from the Eastern Studies Institute. Thank you for the wonderful, interesting presentations. I have a question to Mr. Smirnyagin. I'm really grateful for your in-depth review of the issues. I know we have very little time has passed since you made the study, but I know you are monitoring the situation. After the protests in the Far East, How is the situation developing now, and what are your forecasts? Are there any signs that the center is eager to make adjustment to its policy, and how is the local situation developing? In fact, it's been several months since I was in the Far East last time, but I have people who are collecting information for me there. Initially, in the immediate aftermath, Mr. Darkin made strange moves. He was very effective. He met with the activists, the leaders of the protests, and tried to involve them in developing crisis response policies. But then, the wave of protests became stronger than his influence, and the process became uncontrollable. Manufacturing enterprises, export-producing enterprises came to a standstill, and Darkin only was just promised that these enterprises will be nationalized. It was a stupid move. He disoriented the local residents, and because it was not clear who will buy the products of the enterprise and who will pay the wages to the workers. So in fact, the administration made initially very good steps to balance, to counter the protests, to cushion the protests, but then they lost control. There is very little hope that the central government will make some moves, some effective moves. I was surprised, I was shocked that some very promising measures that President Medvedev put forward to bring the Far East closer to the center geographically, such as provide subsidies for railway tickets. This was not, the population was not impressed at all for some reason. Another interesting thing happened. Premier Putin announced that imported cars will be subject to high import duties. This was a protectionist measure for Russian auto manufacturers. Well, it would seem that people in Tolyatti would thank him, but in fact on the 1st of March the results of elections were very bad for the United Russia, worst in the history of elections. So Russian auto manufacturers did not appreciate the gift which Putin made them. Even less than people in the Far East appreciated his move. The crisis that we're facing will affect dozens of thousands of people in the Far East. You know, I was marveling at the drivers who were bringing used cars from Europe to Russia, people who were trading in cars and buying and selling them. All these people automatically lose their occupation, lose their jobs. And also, local people are very, very unhappy about what Moscow does. Academician Minaker was writing in his academic paper that some decisions made by the Stem Duma are the results of very aggressive lobbying from retailers and other large corporations. For example, there were many policies trying to restrict shuttle trading, cross-border trading between Russia and China, just because large retailers were facing competition from them. So the allowed weight of luggage that is set for such small-scale traders has been reduced, and this is a heavy blow for small business, actually. And this, of course, is seen as Moscow attempts to suffocate the region, to put a pressure on the region. So I'm really not very optimistic about the prospects of Far East development.
question to Dr. Kobayashi. Does your institute fulfill any studies in estimating on demand function for gas, coal, or electricity? Because it's necessary to understand the possibilities of export from Russia, for example, for gas and coal. If yes, where it's possible to find them?
Thank you for your question. Unfortunately, I'm not doing demand-focused analysis, and I can't get you a precise answer. But if you look at the future near-term natural gas demand in Japan, it will be badly damaged by the financial crisis, and indeed, Japanese energy buyers struggle to divert their long-term contract LNG to other locations. But in the mid to long term, we are now discussing about the midterm GHG reduction target, and the answer to the final decision has not been made, so I cannot say anything precisely, but such midterm GHG reduction target will affect the mid to long-term Japanese energy demand structure. I'm sorry.
I mean empirical calculations by using econometric instruments.
Yes. I don't have a specific number now.
Maybe somebody in Japan do it?
Thank you very much. Let's thank the panelists, and now we are changing the settings a little bit to move into the next session.
We have two excellent speakers who are going to give us a broad overview presentation. Our first closing keynote is Dr. Lilia Shetsova. She is a professor and senior associate at the Carnegie Moscow Center. She co-chairs the Russian Politics and Political Institutions Project at the Carnegie Moscow Center. Before joining Carnegie Moscow Center, she was Deputy Director of the Moscow Institute of International Economic and Political Studies at the Russian Academy of Sciences and Director of the Center of Political Studies. She is the author of two very spectacular books, Russia Lost in Transition, Putin's Russia, and many other works you may need to list, and I welcome her to her remarks.
Thank you, Armin. Well, thanks for having me. Well, it was really very productive day and terrific discussion. And I understand that, we are the only obstacle between now and dinner, so I have to be very disciplined. In fact, I got an assignment from our hosts to discuss Russia's trajectory and Russia's future scenarios. And after listening to today's discussion, I'm coming to the conclusion that apparently Russia's scenario and Russia's trajectory is much more vague, controversial, and murky issue comparing to our energy agenda and energy factor. Well, anyway, I've got for you two assertions and 4 points. And let me start with my assertions. Firstly, of course, it's impossible to do justice to the whole issue, to Russia and its substance, challenges, and future possibilities. So I will do my narrative and deliberation operations in a way of brushstrokes. So starting with my first session, I would like to draw your attention to the question of interconnectedness, or, as my friend Sandrine here advised me to use the definition, causality, cause and effect interconnection or relationship. I'm talking about very complicated, weird relationship between the energy factor and Russian development. I would say that the relationship is rather unhealthy. On the one hand, here what I have in mind, on the one hand, energy and energy policy in Russia, just like foreign policy in general, is the servant of domestic agenda and domestic necessities, domestic needs. And the role itself, the role of the energy factor and energy in general, inherently makes energy a very political issue. So inherently it has to be politicized by the Russian political elite if Russian elite wants to use energy to solve domestic problems. So on the other hand, and this is the other side of the story, on the other hand, the energy factor, as we all know in Russia, became one of the most important, even crucial pillar of Russian stability, which has been proved by the current Russian history. Just recently, the energy factor and the oil price, to be exact, became the catalyst for two dramatic events in Russian history. I'm talking about the 80s, when the fall of the oil price became the catalyst that brought in the end the collapse and the demise of the Soviet Empire, of the Soviet Union. And suddenly in 1988, the second time, the demise, the collapse, the fall of the oil price became the reason, one at least of the major reasons, one of the major causes for the meltdown of the Russian economic structure and for the meltdown of the Russian model of capitalism. So in the end, this interconnectedness that is acknowledged, that has been acknowledged by the leadership. Just remember, I want you to remind you at least twice or three times, both then President Putin and then President Medvedev and Prime Minister Vladimir Putin, several times were discussing the issue of Russia's failure to diversify its economy and the consequences that are the results of their failure to diversify Russian economy. So, in fact, what we have all evidence of the existence in Russia of very peculiar petrostate, with all its deficiencies and anomalies, and just like the fusion of between the power and property, like the existence and the emergence of the rentier class with a certain type of behavior. But what is interesting, that Russia differs tremendously from all traditional and classical petrostates, because Russia is a petrostate with nuclear ambitions and nuclear power. So the logic of the nuclear petrostate is totally unknown, even for us, Russian observers. Well, and the second session is about the paradox. Well, one at least of the paradoxes is the fact that, for the time being, Russian political elite and Russian ruling team is desperately looking for the possibilities and for the ways to solve the crisis, to get out of the crisis, or at least to freeze the crisis, by preserving the status quo. Status quo. This is the major goal, ambition, and agenda of the Russian government and Russian administration, which is, in fact, a kind of a nonsense, because even they do understand the status quo, and undiversified, outmoded model of Russian capitalism is one of the causes of the crisis. So, in fact, they are in search of mission impossible. Will they succeed to solve the crisis by preserving the status quo that is the cause of the crisis? So this is the dilemma that Russia is facing together with its political elite and the leadership. And now, very briefly, 4 points, in order not to make you sleepy. Firstly, on political leadership, also a controversy. when we are looking at the political leadership at the ruling tandem that resembles very much the Argentinian tango, we know who's marking the steps. We look at it and see both success of the tango, of the ruling tandem, and the failure. They've been representing absolutely amazing case of imagination, of smart technique, of ability to reproduce the continuity, to reproduce themselves, the system, the political regime, and even the model of capitalism. They did it smartly, they did it successfully. But on the other hand, they failed. They failed dramatically. They failed to predict the coming of the crisis. They failed with their initial steps to sort out the things and to cope with the crisis. And now, I'm not sure, only yesterday, Prime Minister Putin offered us the revised budget, finally, and the anti-crisis package. Today is March 29, 2009. And we've been hit by the crisis already by September. So now we've got finally the anti-crisis package. If you read carefully the package, you're not going to find the word modernization, reform, innovation, or transformation. We forgot the words, because the only goal and agenda is status quo, just self-preservation. And of course we know from history that we already twice had split and divided dual power, and every time Russia returned to the traditional model of power, symbolized by one person on the top. So sooner or later, apparently the ruling tandem will be replaced by the traditional power if the system is not reformed. When it happens, who is going to symbolize a Russian personal-led power? Well, this is the question that will be answered apparently during the next 2 years. The jury is out. Second point on stability. And here I'm going to quote several pretty interesting results of the service. And apparently some of them are known to you. So on the surface, Russia is pretty stable comparing to all those countries our neighbors hate. Just look what's happening and what's going on in Latvia. Look what's going on in Hungary and finally Paris. We are pretty calm, with sporadic pictures of local protests somewhere outside of Moscow. But look, what are the numbers that are telling us about what's really going on, brewing under the surface? So the approval rating of the leaders still is in the 70s, which is amazing. Any political leader in any country hit by crisis could be jealous, could envy this approval rating. But at the same time, the same people asked, the same respondents that support Prime Minister Putin, I didn't make a mistake, yes, Prime Minister Putin and President Medvedev, they say that the system is not effective, the government is not effective, good for nothing. So 50% of the same respondents criticize the system. And you know how many people support the system, the regime, the capitalism? Only 25. 25% of respondents today, according to Levada Center forecasts and studies, search, only 25% support the system. Well, it's a disastrous number. And look at another survey. In November 2008, only 20% of respondents were ready to take to the street and participate in the strikes. What do we have now? In February 2009, 40% of respondents, 40% of Russians are ready to take to the streets. Well, it's a pretty drastic and dire picture. Well, and definitely, the situation with this stability is quite uncertain. Is the stability fragile or brittle? Well, that's a question for deliberation. And especially when we have the final number from the official Russian report of the Russian government, 44% of the people now in the country have the wage arrears of wage delays. And at the same time, there is a question of the Russian political elite that has been so cozy and happy for such a long time. Let's look how the people from the elite are thinking. I hope that you've read at least some of the surveys made by Nicola M. Liberal Mission Foundation and GIMO recently. By the way, it was done before the crisis really hit us. So the research was done in summer 2008. Absolutely amazing, spectacular numbers. Well, they really made a splash in Moscow at least. 45.5% of the representatives of the Russian sub-elite, I'm talking about heads of the departments of different ministries, deputy ministers of the Russian government, representatives of the General Staff Academy, Military Academy. So 45.5% of these people consider that Russian political system is a disaster, it's not effective, it cannot help Russia to modernize, it has to be restructured. And all those people are not looking backwards, are not calling, to return to the Soviet Union. They say we need to restructure the system and the society on the basis of transparency, rule of law, and competition. Another absolutely wonderful number, I see here people, military people are saying, I would like them either to confirm it or just say that the survey is wrong. 46% representatives of the Russian military power structures, of the, not the soldiers, high level of officers. 46% are critical of the Putin system. And only 49 do support them. Well, pretty high number of unsatisfied and frustrated people within the military. Of course, we can say that those people within the elite are not consolidated. They are not, they are not representing the alternative. But there could be several steps, one step between the frustration, lack of hope, and consolidation. And briefly, two other moments on foreign policy. This is another very weird mix of something absolutely incompatible. Foreign policy, on the one hand, is terribly, absolutely terribly old-fashioned. You know what our foreign policy means. You know how Russia wants to look like a besieged fortress from, inside and from outside. But at the same time, it's not a Soviet type of policy. This type of policy could be defined in a very Shakespearean phrase: to be with the West and to be against the West at the same time. It looks like, riding two horses in opposite direction. But again, Russian political elite has masterminded this foreign policy with brilliance. It brilliantly pursues this very strange, incompatible paradigm, shocking the West and forcing the West to accept Russia's rules of the game constantly. In fact, Russian political elite has made absolutely wonderful, amazing, tremendous success during the last 8 years by forcing the Western community and Western political leaders to endorse Russian behavior, Russian political regime, Russian foreign policy and agenda, and to legitimize it. What are the key goals of the Russian foreign policy agenda? Don't meddle. Don't meddle into Russian domestic affairs. Don't meddle into Russia's areas of privileged interest. Conclude an energy pact with us, Russians, and make Russia part of the triad, of the trio, together with the EU and the United States. We want to rule the world as a part of the collective leadership. Is Russian political elite ready to confront the West? No. No. They see quite distantly the red line that they are not going to cross. And at the same time, they use anti-Western rhetoric and will be using anti-Western rhetoric, irrespective whether we, together with the President Obama, will reset the button or not, to mobilize the Russian population inside of the country. So, in fact, this controversial foreign policy is the reflection of the duality, of the dual nature of the Russian political class frontier, that are interested to have good relations with the outside world and at the same time to close the Russian society from the outside world. And scenario, the last point. Well, it's difficult to talk about scenario at the beginning of the process that will have unpredictable consequences. So I will be very trivial and very traditional. It seems to me that we, in fact, have possibility are three options before us. One option is the stagnation option, because in fact, due to different circumstances, not only domestic but also outside external circumstances, Russian political elite and Russian political regime, as a duality, as a tandem, or as a personalistic power represented by one person on the top, or I don't care, and we shouldn't care. Well, in fact, they could sort it out with the crisis. Maybe not in 2009, maybe 2010 or 11, if the oil price picks up. Well, in fact, they're waiting for that. That's the only salvation. And after that, what is in store for us? The same system, the same model of capitalism, the same lack of clear rules of the game, lack of transparency. So hardly this type of system can produce any kind of much more robust, much more effective form and model of capitalism that needs transparency, competition, and rules of the game. So stagnation is quite a possibility, and rather feasible possibility. Second option, let's call it implosion, collapse. Let's call it unraveling of the political system and the regime. Quite possible, maybe less possible than the first option, but still a possibility. And third option, the liberal democratic breakthrough or modernization. Which option Russia will choose? Well, it depends a lot. It depends on the moods within the society, but first of all, on the ability of Russian political elite to use the crisis as a possibility, to use a crisis as a possibility to rethink, Russia's future and an organization of the Russian power. Well, so far, even if we fail to reach the third scenario, in any case, this period that we are living through could be quite useful and quite constructive from one point of view. It may show us, the society, the political elite, and the business circles, the limits, the possibilities of this type of regime, system, state, and capitalism. And maybe it will force us to find new ways and new answers to the question whether Russia. Thank you.
Okay, our final speaker is Dr. Edward Morse, very well known and famous commentator on the oil and natural gas markets. He is the managing director and chief economist of LCM Commodities. Previously, the chief energy economist with Lehman Brothers. We don't hold that against him, since they imploded with not on his advice. So, and my former employer is the publisher of the famous publication Energy Intelligence Group, Petroleum Intelligence Weekly, a long and illustrious career in many different fields, professor at Princeton, and also a member of the Carter administration. So it's a great pleasure I introduce Edward Morse.
Thank you very much, Amy, and thank you, Ambassador Drishin, and the organizers from Carnegie for inviting me to be here with you and to have you anticipate that I'm going to do this very quickly so that you can have a good end of the day. I will try not to disappoint you. I will try to be provocative, maybe not quite as provocative as Lilia was when she looked at what lies ahead in Russia, but somewhat provocative. And I'm going to start really where Amy started this morning, or I'll conclude with the following where Amy started this morning. It's not an accident that we have a very similar view of commodity world. We sort of formed our views more or less at the same time working together. And the fact of the matter is commodities are inherently cyclical in nature. Commodity investment cycles are inevitably inherently cyclical in nature. Most people, 95% of people who analyze commodities forget about their cyclicality. They have a very linear look at commodity cycles and expect that what happened yesterday is going to happen tomorrow, much as the Russian government anticipated what happened yesterday will proceed tomorrow, and prices will continue to go up, and world demand will continue to rise, and the world economy will continue to be relatively healthy. One of the things that Amy forgot to tell you, and that I want to talk about in my concluding remarks, is that with these inevitable cycles, there is something that's very repetitive, but there's also something very different, because at the end of every cyclical peak, when you go into a cyclical trough, the structure of the commodity that you're looking at, and in this case we're looking at oil and gas, the structure of the sector, the structure of the industry, turns out to be very different from what it was when the industrial cycle started. And let me just give you two examples of it, because they're kind of critical to what lies ahead in the energy market, and they form a critical set of parameters for what the opportunities are and what the constraints are for oil and gas producing countries, including Russia. One of the myths about where the energy business is today is the myth that one hears more in Russia than almost in any other producing country in the world. And that myth is that when you go into a cyclical trough, you end investments on the supply side. So one of the expectations in Russia is that Russian production will fall. And that expectation is that production in a lot of other so-called non-OPEC countries is also going to fall as a result of more limited cash flows that result from lower oil prices. This is actually factually untrue. And it's not only been untrue in the past, but I would wager it's going to be untrue in the future. Because there are certain things that happen when you're moving to a peak of the cycle. One of the things that happens is you people in the industry apply new technology to find and develop resources. And there are two really critical areas in which resources have been found and unlocked during the 5 years that we've just gone through. And that will have an impact on this market whenever demand picks up, and I suspect that will be sometime well into the next decade. Sometime well into the next decade, we will arrive at a point in time when the current supply that we see on the market from OPEC countries and non-OPEC countries will have to be replaced by something else. Amy spoke about shale gas in the United States, and she gave you some numbers, but I don't think she stressed two elements of the importance of those numbers. One of them is that one of the half dozen or so plays for shale gas discovery in the United States. She put the numbers up on these, but the Marcellus part of this, which is an area we don't think of as an oil-producing area, but just as Baku was the beginning of Russian oil production. So Pennsylvania was the beginning of American production. And this area in Pennsylvania, West Virginia, and New York State has more gas in it than the Yamal Peninsula, more gas in it than any other large gas field in the world, including the Qatar North Dome field. It is the largest gas field ever discovered, and that's in terms of recoverable material. When one started looking at this, it cost about $10 per million BTU to get at this kind of exploration play. It now costs less than $4 per million BTU to extract this kind of gas. And the gas in North America, where from the east coast of North America to the west coast of North America, is one huge shale gas play. It means that North America, the U.S., if our regulators will be willing to do it, but North America as a whole will, in the next decade, be a net gas exporter to the outside world. There will be LNG exported from Canada, if not from the lower 48 states, just as there is currently LNG exported from Alaska. Now, the shale play is interesting because however robust shale may be in North America, where the innovations have taken place, the shale gas resources of Europe are significantly greater than those of North America. And where are these shale gas resources in Europe? They're in Poland, they're in Romania, they're in Hungary, they're in Germany, they're in France, they're in Belgium, and they're in the United Kingdom. And one of the aspects of the aftermath of Ukrainian natural gas transit problems of the last winter has been that the European Union has commissioned an accelerated study of how to exploit the shale gas resources of the European Union. And you can be sure that a decade from now, we will be seeing those gas shale resources being developed. And at whose expense will those gas discoveries within the European continent go to? They'll go to Russia. For every set of molecules of European gas, there will be fewer molecules of Russian gas that will have a market for them in Western Europe. Now that may not necessarily be totally true. It may be the case that there will be an opportunity there for Russian companies to participate in the development of those gas resources in Europe. It might be the case that the European Union, if it's smart enough, will condition that access to European resources by Russian enterprises, by reciprocity, and not just paper reciprocity, but real reciprocity. And I suspect that will certainly be on the agendas of European countries. So it will affect the European continent's position in the natural gas world, the LNG world, as well as the pipeline gas world. And it will be a kind of fundamental parameter framework for where the future of the Russian energy industry goes. The second area of technological innovation of the last 5 years of high oil prices has been in the exploitation of deep water. And by deep water, I mean water levels of 2,000 meters or deeper. Now, we have, during the past 5 years, been discussing resource nationalism. The Baker Institute has done a significant amount of research on resource nationalism. The Japanese Institute that's with us has done a significant amount of research on resource nationalism. Russia has certainly benefited from resource nationalism during the last 5 years. Resource nationalism is frequently thought of as the major obstacle for international companies to find new resources and develop new resources because of lack of access to those resources. But when it comes to the deep water, the issue has not been resource nationalism. The issue has been lack of access to services and equipment to exploit those resources. Now, what we know is wherever those resources have been found, they have turned out to be pretty robust. So we now have, in the last few weeks, Exxon, the largest of the international oil companies, announcing a discovery in the deep waters offshore Brazil that makes it look like this Exxon discovery, which is an Exxon-Hess Corporation joint venture. It looks like this discovery will be at least as large as the Tupi discovery that was made in Brazil more than a year ago. And the Tupi discovery appears to have been the unearthing of the second largest oil field ever discovered in the world, second largest to the Ghawar field in Saudi Arabia. So wherever there has been exploitation of deep water, something big has been found. What has been the difficulty of exploiting the deep water? It's not lack of access, it's lack of equipment. If we go back to the beginning of this decade, in the year 2000, there were 17 vessels in the world capable of exploring for, finding a discovery, or delineating a discovery in waters deeper than 2,000 meters. And at the beginning of this decade, there was an effort to expand the drilling fleet, and it happened slowly. So we went from 17 at the end of 1999, the beginning of 2000, to an addition of 10 more vessels capable of doing this between 2000 and 2007. And then beginning in 2008 and extending to where we can look at these contracts to 2011 and 2012, To these 27 vessels are being added 130 new ones capable of doing this kind of exploitation. And you know that the discovery is going to be major. You don't know the nature of how major they're going to be. But if you look at where these resources are being looked for, in the Gulf of Mexico, waters of Mexico and the United States, in the waters of the Atlantic Basin offshore Brazil, but if you look at East Africa, offshore Angola, Sonangol announced 2 days ago their belief that the deep water subsalt play in Angola is at least as large as the subsalt play offshore Brazil. It's not only there, but it's in the deep waters offshore the northwest shelf of Australia, in the deep waters of the Caspian, territorially owned by another littoral country of the Caspian other than Russia. They're in the deep waters offshore Indonesia, and the other deep waters where this is possible are the Mediterranean, about which I'll speak in 1 minute, and all of the countries that are littoral to the Arctic. So the United States, Canada, Denmark, the United Kingdom, Norway, and Russia. Russia being the one country that at the moment has no company with any experience exploiting deep water areas, no equipment capable of doing it, no service company that will do it given the magnitude of the undertaking, which means you need an international major to be a partner if you want to do it. I said I was going to mention the deep waters of the Eastern Mediterranean. There have been a couple of discoveries in the deep water of the Mediterranean. There have been 2 big gas discoveries, one offshore Gaza and the other offshore Israel. The one offshore Israel had in its first discovery the announcement of it being order of magnitude 2 trillion cubic feet of natural gas. Now, with further delineation, it's 5 trillion cubic feet of natural gas, sort of at the level of the Troll field offshore in Norway. I believe that as this field gets delineated, it will look more like 50 trillion cubic feet of natural gas. So that will give you a sense of the revolutionary changes that happen just from the geology of this cycle, which has on the upside the incentive to give companies an opportunity to exploit new technology and to go to areas that were previously off limits. My remarks, by the way, are totally extemporized. They are not in my slideshow, which I'm not going to get to, because I thought it would be useful for the framework for what Russia confronts in the future to think of these things. One of the other myths, besides the myth that supply will not be forthcoming, is that costs are just so great that they impede companies that are in the middle of contracting their capital expenditure budgets, impede their ability to find and develop new oil. We forget that this is a cyclical business. And just as costs go up, so costs go down. And we know that some of the critical costs for the oil industry, including steel, which has gone down 50% over the last year, and tubular equipment. Postponing projects not because of the price of oil. They're postponing these projects because of the view of Shell and Exxon and ConocoPhillips and Eni and Total and the other ones that are looking at the tar sands. They're postponing them because they believe that the costs of finding and developing this material next year will be 50% of what it was last year. Last year it required an oil price of $90 to incentivize them to do this. Next year it will require an oil price of $40 to $45 to incentivize them to do it. So just because cash flow is going down doesn't mean that budgets are going down in real terms. The efficiency of budgets is going up. If you look at the current pace by which the costs of finding and developing oil have receded over the last 3 months, it's been at a pace of 4% per month. And that pace is accelerating. So the last month that we had data for last month, it is now going down at 5% per month. And if they continue to go down at this pace, then by the end of this year, we will see oil and gas development costs at less than half of what they were in the middle of the boom a year ago. So this is the kind of constraint that is affecting companies. I want to talk a little bit about what I had planned my remarks on, and that is a little bit about the geopolitics of energy. There are really three energy superpowers in the world. They have very different orientations to the world. They are Saudi Arabia, the United States, and Russia. They're the three countries, if you could think of three countries that potentially have the most influence on hydrocarbon development that you would go to look at to see what they want and what they do. And they're all giant. They sort of are larger by orders of magnitude than any other individual countries that participate in the global energy sector. One of the striking differences between Saudi Arabia and the United States on the one hand and Russia on the other hand is that Saudi Arabia is a waterborne exporter. All of its exports go on the waters, and that gives them, as the largest exporter of oil in the world, the opportunity to direct a third of their exports to North America, a third to Europe, a third to Asia, more or less in equal amounts. In recent days, they've trimmed their exports to Europe and increased their exports to Asia, where markets have been growing and netback receipts have been higher. But they have something as a waterborne exporter that is enviable, namely the security of markets, because they can export to any place in the world. The U.S. has, by virtue of its size, by virtue of its openness to trade, another enviable position, because it is a market where you know you can sell if you have access to it, and where you can sell in that market in good times and in bad times. Even in times like today when demand is shrinking, the U.S. market is open to crude oil from around the world, and whether you have light oil or heavy oil at a given moment in time makes it for you a less or more attractive market. Russia is the only one of these three superpower energy centers that doesn't have access to the waterborne world. And indeed, the fact that Russia is essentially two things. One is a pipeline exporter of oil and of natural gas, essentially. And secondly, a giant when it comes to world standards, but a giant that is constrained by a European market and a giant that's constrained by having very large companies at home and a tiny presence internationally. And I would suggest that a lot of the politics of Russian oil and gas development of the past few years, including the politics associated with this government as it's used oil and gas to consolidate power in Moscow, to consolidate power in the country, to consolidate influence in the near abroad, is a limited kind of geopolitical framework. And that in the end of the day, a pipeline-constrained superpower has much less freedom to move than somebody who's in this on a waterborne basis. And it's something to ponder over when you consider what Russian options are and what they should be, because beyond the consolidation of power in the near abroad, you are certainly deleveraged. You are certainly at the wrong end of the pipeline when you're the exporter rather than the buyer. And the pipeline gives the buyer significant power over the seller that severely handicaps the seller. Let's say the pipeline to Beijing is completed and there's no spur line that goes to the Pacific Ocean. That means the Chinese can say, well, the pipeline's built. If you want to put throughput in it, we'll pay 50% of what you thought we were going to pay. And if you don't want to accept that, now that all the costs are sunk, we can always buy the oil from someone else. You are unbelievably constrained if you're the exporter on a pipeline system. The second set of remarks that I want to talk about or leave with you in my comments are three different worlds, three different rules of the game. And they are the worlds of the OECD, the world of OPEC, and the world of some other countries. And here's where I go back to my very first remarks following on Amy's remarks about cycles. We ended the cycle in the 1970s, a period of time like today's, of unexpected, rapidly increasing prices, followed by dramatically unexpected price collapses in the early 1980s. In the 1970s, the OECD countries were the countries in the world that were thriving on resource nationalism. The OECD countries had, each of them except for the US and Germany, national heroes. They had national flag oil and gas companies that were owned by the state, that were used by the state to pursue non-energy purposes or energy purposes which were buttressed by other kinds of purposes, foreign policy linked. And it appeared as though there were going to be newcomers to the world of national oil companies within the OECD. Canada created Petro-Canada at the end of this cycle, was perhaps the most nationalistic of all of the national oil companies of the OECD. And then what happened in the 1980s? All of these national oil companies were either demolished as national oil companies. They became, through IPOs, normal companies. Or, as the one case that remains, Statoil in the OECD of an existing company. Sure, it's owned 59 or whatever percent is by the state, but the state doesn't do anything in it for national interest purposes other than to earn money, because Statoil is treated pari passu as an equal participant on the Norwegian continental shelf with international private companies against which it has to compete. So we've seen the state disappearing from that part of the world which represents 40% of the international oil market. OPEC sort of is at the other extreme. They don't like markets. They don't like market mechanisms. They don't like the private sector. They deal with them to the degree they can. Strikingly different from the OECD world, where we who live in it tend to think that if you trade more, if you have no political barriers to trade flows, to capital flows, everybody in the end wins, citizens are better off. Looking at the energy world from the perspective of Saudi Arabia, let's say, that's looking at the world from the perspective of if we win, you lose, or maybe if we win, you're going to win too, but we're going to win a lot more than you. And if there's a bad period of time of low prices, such as the one we're going through today, we're going to do what we can to push the burden of adjustment onto other countries. Saudi Arabia is also unique in this regard, and I do think this is a critical part of the Russian context. Saudi Arabia is unique in that it has a GDP about the same size as the state of New Jersey in the United States. Saudi Arabia would not count for very much in the world were it not for the fact that it has, as a matter of policy, keeping oil in productive capacity offline, having a surplus, as Amy said. If Iran goes offline for whatever reason tomorrow, Saudi Arabia can overnight replace all of Iran's exports. Saudi Arabia can actually overnight replace all of the oil production of Iran. It can replace all of the oil exports of the number 2 and the number 3 exporter within OPEC. It's a phenomenal position to be in. Saudi Arabia had lost that position for surprising reasons that have nothing to do with peak oil, but rather have to do with the failure of states in Venezuela, in Nigeria, in Iraq and Iran, all of which should be producing today 8 million barrels a day, more than they're producing. And 10 years ago, most people, whether in Saudi Aramco or in Lukoil or in ExxonMobil thought that they would be producing 8 million barrels a day more, so they delayed their investments because they didn't want to compete in a market where they thought that 8 million barrels a day was going to be. So Saudi Arabia used its capital to get back to the point where it can replace the number 2 and the number 3 exporters. And now in this current environment, they have a clear preference, and the preference is for radically lower prices than what prevailed in the last 5 years. And by radically lower, it means even lower than the price that the market went up to yesterday, over $50 a barrel for West Texas Intermediate crude. I think the Saudis want to see oil at around $40 a barrel, which they are very comfortable within their own budget constraints are, for a period of time. And I don't think they want to see oil much above $50 or $55 a barrel until 2010 or 2011. And while they talk about 75, they talk about that someday, not this year and not next year. And they know who they want to punish, by the way. Amy picked on Iran. They want to punish 3 countries. They want to punish Iran, they want to punish Russia, and they want to punish Venezuela. And they're in a position to do so. And they want to punish Iran and Russia because they don't like either's policy in their neighborhood. They don't like Russian policy that has been more supportive of Iranian nuclear ambitions than the policies of other countries. And they have a wonderful weapon to do this. In between these 2 different worlds is the world of what we normally call the BRICS, Russia, China, and in addition to that, Brazil, India, and to some degree Mexico. These are countries that, to one degree or another, haven't decided whether they're part of the market world or whether they're part of the non-market world. And it's there, as Lilia had described earlier, when you convert what's happening in the Russian domestic political system into the international stage, that there really are emerging stark choices. And 2 years ago, it was popular to say that the world of resource nationalism was winning out over the world of markets. But if you look at the third group of countries who are not part of the OECD and not part of OPEC, and you look at China, Brazil, and India in particular, they have all moved over toward market economics. And yes, they use, to some degree or another, the state and the instruments of the state for non-energy policy purposes. But they are inherently reliant on markets and win-win solutions. And Mexico, which is, along with Russia, one of the other 2 remaining in this mid-path, is slowly seeing the reasons for overcoming the national monopoly position they have for Pemex. So that leaves Russia as sort of a decade from now, the only country you have to think about as to whether it's a market option or whether it's a non-market option, and where the win-win would be. I'm not going to go through my other slides, but I'd like to end with my final concluding remarks on what Russia's choices are in this arena, because it's clear that Russia, from a national interest perspective, has not liked the rules of the game of the OECD. It has not liked the rules of the game of OPEC. OPEC countries don't want Russia to be part of it in any event. And I think the challenge for the Russian political community now, as it acts and gets over the current position of being a deer looking at headlights, paralyzed about what to do, having budgets that are out of whack with revenue, and expecting oil prices to come back tomorrow or the year after tomorrow, but they're not going to come back tomorrow or the year after tomorrow. And that means rethinking what the national interests are, rethinking what is sustainable, rethinking how perhaps one can overcome the squandered years of the last 5 when revenue generated from hydrocarbon exports, which made Russia only 5 months ago the 3rd largest holder of currency in the world after China and and Japan, and now no longer in that same league as Russia was only a half a year ago, of what the rules are that will benefit the country. And I suspect whether the choice is the right or wrong choice, the right choice, as one thinks through Russian national interests, will be to move from being a lumpy European supplier of resources to being a global supplier of resources, to think about what it takes to be a global supplier, which means different kinds of partnership arrangements, different rules of reciprocity. If you want access to the outside world, time will be to give access on a pari passu equal basis to foreign companies that one gives to national companies, and that transit rules, which are rules that have been adopted internationally within the European Union, will have to be the same rules that will be in Russia's self-interest going forward internationally. So those may be difficult to swallow, but I think the constraints combined on the international side with the constraints domestically from lower revenues will push the logic of political choice in that direction, or at least one hopes they will. Well, thank you very much, Amy and Ambassador Deresian and Carnegie, for inviting me, and it's been a pleasure to be here and share my observations with you.
So let me just ask the audience one last time before we all part and go our separate ways. If anybody wants to ask a question to either of the speakers.
Oleg Voronin, Higher School of Business. Probably I have some naive questions, in particular to Professor Shevtsova, whose presentation was just wonderful. You shared several points. First of all, one of the key wrong factors in policy is to use energy policy for political purposes. I would be very grateful to Professor if she named a political regime or any single country where energy policy is not used or where it is not politicized. This would be interesting to know. Another naive question. You mentioned Medvedev-Putin tandem, which did something but failed to do something else. They failed to predict the crisis. But then my question to you, can you name a single political leader or economic leader who could predict the crisis? Ben Bernanke or Alan Greenspan, maybe others of whom I am not aware. Question number 3. You referred to a whole number of sociological studies which were done by the Levada Center, surveys by Levada Center. I just wonder whether there are similar surveys by the National All-Russia Center for Public Polls. We all know that sociologists always respond to what they are told to do. And finally, just one comment. I had my teacher, my late teacher, Mikhail Gifter, always talked about Russia as a country where all processes are proceeding very slowly. But then, when they transcend some boundary, what follows is the outbreak, this typical Russian outbreak. So, are we still approaching this borderline, or are we already beyond it? Let me try to respond to your naive questions. And I will start with the last one. I just did not understand what you talk about when you were mentioning, claim that none of the political leaders could predict the crisis. To a great extent, you're right. We are dealing with different countries. claim neither the US President, nor the French President, nor the German Chancellor, nor the British Prime Minister, when we're talking about the crisis last spring. But the German Chancellor, nor the British Prime Minister, but political leaders could be mistaken. We're talking about the crisis last spring. Only they did not know the answers to the questions. But they were acting within systems where counter-crisis mechanisms were in place. In our case, political leaders failed to predict the crisis within a system which they created themselves. This system lacks any counter-crisis mechanisms or conflict resolution mechanisms. These are just two different systems.
They created themselves. This system lacks any.
As for your claim that sociologists do what they're told to do, it means that you doubting
your claim that sociologists do what they're told to do,
professional qualities and professional
doubting the
integrity of our sociologists. I'm not sure about the survey of the second echelon of the elite.
I'm not sure about
but as for the study of
the second echelon of the elite,
degree of trust to the authorities, and I think the Levada Center and the Central Opinion Poll Center had very similar results in this respect.
Authorities, and I think the Levada Center and the Central Opinion Poll Center
when I was saying that
very similar results.
Energy resources are used for political purposes, I was not giving any
When I was saying
estimates. I was just stating the fact that because of particular Russian political models, the use of energy resources is always has political implications. Whether or not this is true, this is arguable. But please do not misinterpret
always has political
what I was saying.
implications to it. Whether or not this is true, this is arguable. But please
is there any country where energy policy is not, energy resources are not politicized? Energy resources are always politicized. The extent of politicization is always different. I know no other country, including Saudi Arabia, maybe some Arabian countries, like Iran, Iraq,
I know of no other country,
Hussein
including Saudi Arabia.
So
maybe some Arabian countries.
where political regime wanted to affect the future of the political regime in another country.
Where political regime wanted to affect the future of the political regime in another country.
Yershov from the Foreign Economic Relations Institute of the Higher School of Economics. So, the very last speaker gave us very interesting facts
of the Higher School of Economics,
which may change the view of the whole situation, the way we view the situation. And he also commented on
which may change
Tanaka's
the whole
statement he made
the way we view
just a week ago. And he was saying that by year 2013 the world may face a new crisis, and that is underproduction of oil
he was saying that
because of lack of financing, which is already evident, and that sometime in year 2014 the price of oil may go up to somewhat like $200 per barrel.
Sometime in year 2014 the price
respect
of oil
the authority of Mr. Tanaka, who is the head of the largest international forecasting center, but I think
respect the authority of Mr. Tanaka, who is the
this,
head of the largest
this should
international
have a proper place in
center.
our assessments of the future of the crisis. Mr. Tanaka has a good background.
Proper place in our assessments of
last
future of
some
the
very
crisis.
recent publication includes a study of 300 largest oil fields, and 580 of them are suffering from chronic decline in production. The General Secretary of OPEC is adding his view by saying that out of 140 companies, 35 companies
adding
have
to this
frozen
view by saying
their
that
large projects. So what
out
do you
of
think?
140 companies,
Yeah, thank you very much for the
35
question. I will also
companies
use
have frozen
the floor
their